Hello, my name is Jim Donaghey. Thanks to Gloria and Gabriel and everyone at ALTERSEA for inviting me to present today, and thanks to Astrid for chairing the panel. Thanks also to Pradeepa and Mohammed for presenting alongside me. I'll be talking today about anarchism in contemporary Indonesia, especially its connections with punk counterculture. I will speak about repression against punks and anarchists and the changing motivations that inform that repression and the response of punk and anarchist communities to this repressive context. I'll start with a quick overview of the historical trajectory of anarchism in Indonesia before looking at the re-emergence of anarchism alongside punk in the very late 1980s, but mainly the 1990s. I will detail the forms of repression faced by punks and anarchists, and especially the religious dimension of that repression. I will then chart a partial shift in the authorities' understanding of anarchism and how that has altered the repressive context as a result. The main focus of this presentation is contemporary, but just to set some of the historical context, it is well known that Marxism was the dominant ideology of the revolutionary left in Indonesia throughout the first half of the 20th century and into the 1960s, especially as manifested in the mass movement Partai Komunis Indonesia, PKI. This was at one point the largest communist party in the world that hadn't yet seized power. However, anarchism was a significant strand from the inception of the movement opposing the Dutch colonial government, and even within the explicitly Marxist PKI, anarchism also had some influence. In 1926, for example, the party's newspaper, API, featured quotes from the anarchist political philosopher Bakunin on its front page, and this was such a strong influence that 2 years earlier, in 1924, a leading PKI figure named Darsono insisted that PKI members should remember that the communism of Marx and not the anarchism of Bakunin must govern the party. According to Bima's 2018 book, differences in political ideology within the Indonesian left were not actually a significant problem because they had a common enemy in the invaders of the Dutch East Indies. And according to Bima, anarchist ideas have in fact coloured Marxist and social democratic organisations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. My own knowledge of this earlier anarchist movement in Indonesia is somewhat limited, I must admit. So I don't know whether it's the case that this anarchist current in the PKI was successfully suppressed by orthodox Marxists such as Darsono, or whether anarchist-minded activists were able to organise independently within specifically anarchist organisations and unions. But whatever the case, anarchism persisted to at least some extent within the political lexicon of Indonesia into the 1960s, and it is notable that the prominent student activist Sohokji described himself as an anarchist at that time in his correspondences with Benedict Anderson, though I am not aware of his direct involvement in any explicitly anarchist organisations. After 1965, that all changed, of course. The installation of the Suharto regime and the ensuing Red Scare and murder campaign practically destroyed any left-wing political current in Indonesia. But significantly, the persisting legal repressions against the left targeted the PKI and Marxism, or Marxist-Leninism specifically. Anarchism itself was not legally prescribed, and as such, for many years in the latter part of the 20th century and early 21st century, anarchism was not recognised by the authorities as a leftist political current, but merely as a synonym for chaos, as I will explain. In some ways, this hasn't changed, but the picture has been complicated in recent years, as I will discuss. So the re-emergence of anarchism then was some 25 years later in the 1990s. Punk arrived in Indonesia in the very late 1980s, primarily through punk individuals travelling from the Netherlands to Indonesia. For example, one person from the Dutch band Antidote was instrumental in sending punk records and anarchist literature to the nascent punk scene in Bandung. By 1996, amid the growing anti-Suharto movement, the first political punk scene in Indonesia was produced in Bandung, titled Submissive Riot, with others such as Contaminasi Propaganda appearing in subsequent years. You can see them in the images here. More widely, Sean Martin Iverson describes the Reformasi period as the high point for anarcho-punk in the Indonesian underground. Punks and anarchists who participated in the anti-Suharto movement framed their struggle as anti-fascist, fighting against the militarist, capitalist and totalitarian aspects of Suharto's regime. You can see some anti-fascist imagery from a punk record here to the right of your screen. Indeed, the collective responsible for producing the Submissive Riot zine developed into an organised group called Front Antifascist, or Anti-Fascist Front, in 1997. The zine Militancy, on the top right, is by FAF, and you can see people holding the FAF banner with a punk aesthetic quite apparent there. Their activism included protests, cultural production, organising workers to take strike action at a local factory, and even taking over a government radio station to broadcast anti-Suharto messages. After the collapse of the Suharto regime in 1998, FAF joined with other anti-fascist groups across Indonesia to form Jaringan Antifascis Nusantara, or JAFNUS, the Archipelago Anti-Fascist Network. A later group called Jaringan Anti-Authoritarian, JAO, Anti-Authoritarian Network, was formed in 2007. The political activism of the punk movement arguably shifted to a focus on cultural production in the post-Reformasi years, but as Martin Iverson notes, Indonesian punks continue to participate in class-oriented political action, from solidarity with striking workers to participating in May Day demonstrations, and May Day protests have been very significant in recent years. The creation of a new anti-anarchy police division in March 2011 highlighted the state's fundamental misunderstanding or overlooking of anarchism as a political current. Since this police division was created to quell religious mob-based attacks and rioting by groups such as Front Pembela Islam, and this had nothing to do with targeting anarchist political activists. Rioting football fans in 2016 were also described as supporter anarchists in June 2016 by the new Chief of Police, Tito Carnavian, and we'll have more from him later. This misunderstanding of anarchism does not mean, however, that anarchists were free from repression during this period, and indeed repression against anarchists has been most commonly experienced through the anarchist movement's association with punk being regularly repressed because of its perceived religious contraventions. To give just two examples quite quickly, in December 2011, 64 punks were abducted at gunpoint by Sharia police in Banda Aceh and interned for 10 days at a boot camp for religious re-education. The mayor defended her actions to the international news media, insisting that the raid was necessary and would be repeated as punk constituted a new social disease. She said that punk was in conflict with the Islamic and cultural traditions of Aceh and Indonesia, and hence must be eliminated. This repression extends, and the religious nature of it extends beyond Aceh. In 2016, the first Lady Fast feminist punk music festival was held in Yogyakarta. A group of men disrupted the festival, shouting Allahu Akbar, God is great, and accused the organisers of corrupting morals, dressing inappropriately, and being communists. The police stopped the mob's attack and the festival, and then proceeded to detain the festival organisers, questioning them about the nature of their event and about a book on LGBT rights the police discovered at the venue. So the religious dimension is clear in both cases, but so too is the continuing Red Scare in this case and the accusation of being communists. So it's apparent that political repression intertwines closely with the core religious repression of punk, and by extension anarchism, in Indonesia. But the key point is that until this point, the authorities misunderstood punk and the anarchist movement that was closely associated with it because they were preoccupied with the outwardly visible contraventions of Islamic doctrine. They failed to grasp the connections with anti-statist and anti-capitalist politics. Clearly, this misapprehension did not protect anarchists and punks from repression, but it likely altered the scope and form of that repression. The increasing influence of neoliberalism in Indonesia has been impactful, both on anarchist activisms and on repressive policing. Despite the hopes for a restructuring of society, neoliberalism and neocolonialism have been accelerated in post-Reformasi Indonesia, with privatisation and greater penetration by global corporations under the veil of democratisation, as George Katsiafikis puts it. The environmental and social damage caused by this rampant neoliberalism has been a motivation for resistance and activism by groups linked to the anarchist movement and by the anarchist-associated punk scene. You can see some anti-neoliberal and anti-corporate stickers, posters, zines and patches here from various Indonesian cities. The Farm or Die zine is part of the long-running campaign against the ruinous effects of corporate iron mining in the Kulon Progo area near Yogyakarta. The Unrest Collective produced this zine, detailing the struggle of the Paguyuban Petenai Lahan Pantai PPLP or Society of Coastal Land Farmers, to protect native farming methods and their community, and there have been various solidarity actions in other cities as well. The Forum Solidaritas Melawan Penggusuran Solidarity Forum Resisting Eviction in Taman Sari, Bandung in 2018 highlighted exactly this neoliberal motivation behind the ongoing land grab by the city government there, as well as identifying it as an extension of Suharto-era corruption. The anarchist influence on the resistance campaign is clear in the imagery here, with punk music also playing a key role in the cultural aspects of the protest. In these cases, neoliberal development projects are being resisted, and the police and other state forces are recognised as the enforcers of this neoliberal agenda. The involvement of the anarchist movement at the forefront of this anti-neoliberal struggle and their direct confrontation against the police as agents of this neoliberal authoritarian regime has led to a step change in the Indonesian state's understanding of anarchism. Having been overlooked and misunderstood for decades, anarchist-informed activism is now on the police radar, with anarcho-syndicalism specifically being denounced by Tito Carnavian in the media as a new ideological spectre alongside communism and Islamic extremism. He called it a foreign doctrine and an international phenomenon and ordered police personnel to map out the group's members. May Day 2019 saw significant protest actions in Surabaya, Makassar, Yogyakarta, Malang, Jakarta and in Bandung. As evidence of the repression now faced by anarchists during that May Day event in Bandung, police arrested 619 of the estimated 1,000 protesters for vandalism and destruction of public property, who were then beaten, stripped and bullied. They had their heads shaven and were subjected to re-education. This response is strongly reminiscent of the repression of the Aceh 64 in 2011. You can see that in the images here. Arrests of alleged anarcho-syndicalists were also made at this time in West Java, East Java and South Sulawesi, and the media portrayed the anarcho-syndicalists as masterminding the protests and property damage and infiltrating the May Day march. This is not to say that anarchism is now well understood by the powers that be, nor by scholars. Indeed, an academic named Andreas Wimmer in 2014 made the absurd characterization of contemporary anarchists in Indonesia as part of the growing Marxist jihadist collaboration. The conflation with Marxism is at least interesting, considering the historical closeness in the Indonesian context, but the suggestion that anarchism is connected to jihadism is ludicrous, and this parroting of the warped state narrative on this issue is evidence of deeply uncritical scholarship on Wimmer's part. And despite Carnavian's identification of anarcho-syndicalism as a new spectre, he returned to using the term anarchist more indiscriminately in September 19 to announce an edict to repress protests in Papua if they have the potential to be anarchic, berpotensi anarchis. So the confused misapplication of anarchism by the state actually persists even after the high-profile May Day 2019 events. But despite this continued confusion from the state, to some degree, the rhetoric has changed in recent years, and anarchist activists, at least when they're named as anarcho-syndicalists, are now explicitly repressed on political grounds. As a result, it may be argued that strategies of evasion are more necessary for punks and anarchists now. This is not a new strategy. Punks and anarchists have long faced harassment and religiously motivated repression, and groups have established countercultural hubs on the outskirts of cities as a means to escape this day-to-day interference and to establish sustainable focal points for punk and activist organising. The images here suggest some of this under-the-radar approach. The red and black anarchist flag is from Racun Island in the Java Sea, where an event called Libertad Fest was held by a punk collective in an attempt to get beyond the interference of the police. In the gig poster at the bottom, the address is not given. You have to ask a punk and be in the loop to find out the relevant information. So some of this evasive strategy is voluntary, but not always. In the wake of the May Day 2018 protests and the anti-airport protests in Yogyakarta of the same year, when a police station was burned down, a local anarcho-feminist collective was forced to vacate their house, having been targeted by Yogyakarta local cops with a concerted campaign against them in their neighbourhood. Like in other groups in other cities, they have since relocated to the fringes of the city. This evasion may be viewed as a form of retreat, but there is a tactical advance here too in the benefits of long-term bases for networking, activism and politicisation. Strategies of evasion and confrontation should not be seen as mutually exclusive either. Stable or safe spaces that can evade repression continue to nourish the wider countercultural networks, and these networks underpin instances of confrontational resistance and long-term struggle against neoliberal authoritarianism. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments, and you can see here some of the references that I've used in the presentation. Thank you very much.